Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Weaver, co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute. And my colleague on the call today is Cameron Norman with Sense Limited?
Yes.
Sense Limited.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, I think maybe what we'll do is we'll get underway. Hey, so it's really my pleasure to be joining Cameron again on this webinar series. It's the second of 3 webinars that we will be chatting together on the whole idea behind, or the whole concept behind innovation and design. And so it's really exciting to be co-hosting with you, Cameron. And so what I thought I would do is just introduce you to everyone, for those of you that are new to the call, and so they'll know a little bit about your background. So Cameron is a professional designer, psychologist, evaluator, and educator. And Cameron's interested in the science and practice of innovation. Sensemaking, which is the consultancy firm that you run, started as a way for Cameron to share his thoughts on innovation, the process of designing, implementing, and evaluating new ideas and putting them into the world. And that has now blossomed to over 500 posts. That's probably even more than 500 posts. You're a pretty prolific poster of resources and multiple learning channels. Cameron is the principal and president of Sense Limited, an innovation consultancy that helps organizations to design, develop, deploy, and evaluate innovation in human systems, particularly in the health and social sectors. He's also an adjunct professor at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. So Cameron, welcome again.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Liz. I look forward to our conversations every time we chat, and this series has been a great chance to share some thoughts on design, but also just a chance for us to have some real conversation, which is something that I think is really exciting. And I think probably those of you who are on the call, if you don't think it's exciting, well, I sure hope by the end of the call
we hope excited. So. yeah, for sure. We hope so as well. And I think, every time I participate in these calls with you, I learn new things, and I'm continually thinking about, okay, so how do I adapt the way that I work in this kind of work of community change and, innovation in new ways based on our conversation. So it's they're always both provocative and challenging. So because there are some people who've been with us before and others who are just joining us for the first time, maybe what we want to do is ground everybody again in the design helix. So I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about this approach that you kind of conceived of and developed.
Yeah. So, and thanks, Connor, for showing this. So this is the design helix, and really what this is a framework. And all a good framework, at least this framework is the concept of guardrails that you see on like steps going down into, say, if you're walking down a flight of steps, you get your guardrails. It's the things to hold, or on a highway. I like to think of these as guide rails of sorts. So they're the sort of the things that just help direct you. It's not a prescription, but what it means is that when we design something, we go through a variety of these steps, and sometimes some of them take a long time. Sometimes they don't. It depends on the timing and everything like that. But there's a lot of different steps. But what it does is it just gets us to remind ourselves as to what goes into creating something. Because as we saw right there from the beginning was that, where people are at is design is about putting things into the world. It's great it involves coming up with ideas. So if you look at it, it's designed, no pun, or maybe a pun intended, it is meant to be like the lifeblood of the things that we create. It's meant to reflect that, hence the helix. So you see these two strands. You've got imagination and production, and we're constantly weaving those two things together. We're imagining new things and we're producing something. So you need to have both. Lots of imagination is great, but if it doesn't generate something new, they're just good ideas. And that's exciting, but it doesn't actually make change happen. Production is easy, not easy. It might be simple, but if you don't have the right idea and you haven't really thought things through, you might produce things that aren't providing a lot of value and might end up actually causing harm as well as providing benefit. So you want to make sure that those two things are in there. And there's this step, there's this process. You can see about perception, discovery, some research, sense making, really trying to understand what it is that we're finding by asking the right question. There's this idea about animation and prototyping. So taking those ideas and then turning them into something much more substantive, and then figuring out how it fits with the world, playing around with it, and then putting it out. And those last two areas are about implementation and sharing. I always like to think of this as not being something that's rigid. It's not something that you don't think about it as a formula, but as, again, those sort of guide rails to get you to think, have you done these sorts of steps, and to what extent?
Yeah, and in the next slide, you kind of have taken the design helix and turned it or connected the parts, because there are parts of this process where you might go through some of the imagination and some of that early design, and then you have to flip back a little bit or flip forward a little bit. So it's interesting, how putting this on its side also says that it's a bit dynamic as a process.
Absolutely. And that's the thing that this diagram does is just like a helix, just like our DNA, is it's woven into strands. So if we're looking to make a difference in our community, communities are living systems. You don't just create something and that's just done. You create something, you put it out into the world, and we'll see some examples of that in our conversation today, but sometimes you put things into the world and they have an enormous amount of benefit, but over time they stop having that benefit because everything else is changing around you. So you constantly are going through this imagination and production in different phases and different sort of waves and things like that. But it's interconnected until the point of which sometimes we design things out of existence and create new things because they've had their time and they've accomplished whatever it is that we set to do, and now we're on to different problems. But sometimes those problems persist, kind of like the whack-a-mole kind of thing there, that we address one problem and it creates another one. Well, that's design. That's our designs are doing their job, which means we have to keep doing their job to address everything that comes from that.
I wonder if iteration 3 or 4 of this image is both having some on ramps and off ramps in the helix. So that would be kind of interesting, right? Because this kind of looks like you keep going around, but there might be off ramps, as you mentioned, right? Things that, given the context, no longer are relevant because the context has shifted so much. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, and that's a really important point, Liz, is that it's true, is that at some point we don't just keep spinning around. At some point, again, things have come to their conclusion, and sometimes you have new things that get added into this. So it is dynamic. That's really the word I would say.
And so just going back to this and bringing the folks who are on the webinar with us, we did a whole webinar on the innovations strand. That was the first webinar in the series, and this one is on the production strand and really focusing on the production strand. And then our final webinar in the series, we're going to give you some practical examples of design in practice and hear from folks who have brought in prototyping and sense making and all of these different elements. So that's coming up in February. So let's talk a little bit about this. So you've kind of taken us a little bit through the key elements. I know that when we were chatting prior to the webinar, we were talking about the blocks that sometimes occur in the production process. And so maybe you could kind of, as we're going through those elements, talk a little bit about some of the blocks and some of the ways to navigate at a high level.
Yeah. So one of the big things is that it's almost the idea of viewing this as a continuous process. And sometimes what ends up happening is it's in the process of developing something, that production stage, that we often find that sometimes convey flow, because everything's got a bit of a limit in terms of its visualization. There are times where you're starting to produce things, and as you get closer and closer to making your idea real, you start to realize maybe the idea isn't that good. Maybe things aren't really, they're not what we thought they were, and sometimes that happens later on in the process. I use this somewhat jokingly, but it's true. Like, occasionally, have you ever ordered something online and you get it delivered to you, and you look at it and you're like, well, that is actually what the picture looked like, but I thought it was going to look a little differently, and I thought it was going to feel a little differently. It's not really what I wanted. Now, that's not exactly the design process, but that same phenomenon does come out there. So we end up having some blocks within things. Part of it also is another thing is that production, because the reason we engage in design is that we want to produce something. We've got a problem, we want to produce a solution. We have a need, we want to produce a service or a product. But the blocks off also can come in by that striving for. We keep wanting to get to the end. We want to produce that thing. And sometimes it can mean we rush through things. There's no one time. Like, some of these things can go through very quickly. You can cycle through the Helix very quickly. Sometimes it takes a long time. And this is somewhat of a unsatisfying answer, but it takes as long as it needs to. So you want to push it, you want to encourage it, but you can't force it. And that's really the key thing. And oftentimes one of the blocks to production and solution generation is when we want to force something. Because we've all seen that, and without wanting to call out any particular group or organization, we're in a pandemic. We've seen policies that have been designed thoughtfully. Obviously, there's an urgency to things, but that have gone in and that they've if we go through that Helix, we think about, they've perceived a problem, they've discovered what needs to happen, they've made sense of what's going on, they've turned it into something, they figured out how well it fits, and they've tinkered over time, and it's come through, and it's worked reasonably well. And then we've seen it where they try to rush something, where people have sat back and waited, and they waited a little too long, and then all of a sudden you've got to rush something in there, and it feels half-baked. People have tried to rush something. I'm not necessarily, and that's really what happens, is everything is of its time. And and there's different jurisdictions you can see where you can go, yeah, they're doing things well. I mean, not perfectly and all that other stuff, but you can see where you have a poor policy almost by design.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? I think the pandemic provides a very kind of interesting illustrative example for all of this. I know you've been going a little bit in and out with your sound, but it is a really kind of case in point where you can see good sense making, and where the ideation, the innovation, kind of the imagination is weaving through. Those imaginative steps are weaving through really well, and then the production steps are weaving well together. But we can also point to some of our recent experience where, yeah, it has been, they rush to a solution, whoever they are, rush to a solution, and yeah, it actually created more distrust and more acrimony and more consternation, in terms of that. So it's almost like, yeah, these things have to be connected together, and that is a sound way of designing things.
One of the big issues is that with perception is the idea of trying to understand, are you tackling the right problem? And there's a great exercise that I often teach people, and it's really simple. It's called the 5 whys. It was developed or popularized. I won't say it was developed, but it was popularized by Toyota, actually. And there's variations. You can do 7 whys or 10 whys, and that. I honestly find that 5 is usually pretty good. And what it is kind of like a root cause analysis framework. It's really simple. Anybody who's spent any time around kids knows the 5 whys very well. It's basically like when you talk about a problem, you ask why. Why is that the problem? Well, because of something else. Well, why is that the issue? And what it does is it helps us drill down to understand, is that, are we tackling the right problem? And oftentimes what happens is the further we can get closer to the root cause, that's like getting upstream, the more impact we're going to have. Because very often we design things to tackle symptoms as opposed to problems. And the further we can get closer to but the interesting thing is that if you don't spend time in that perception stage by really thinking that through, you often produce solutions to thinking that you're solving the problems when really you're not. You're basically trying to just paper over some of the issues attached to it.
Yeah, I really like the 5 whys as a way of kind of trying to get closer and closer to the problem. And I think, the perception piece, the way that we tackle it at Tamarack is to include people with the lived and living experience of the issue. And that's a way of understanding, how they're navigating in the world right now, right? And so how I might perceive a problem and how someone, a young person or a person living in poverty might perceive that, it could be very, very different.
Yeah. This is about doing your research in essence, but it's also really getting yourself to challenge yourself some questions. A famous example that's been used around perception is the idea around, we've talked a little bit about this before, is the idea of using a power drill. And a lot of times people own power drills. And when asked why people have power drills, one of the big reasons why people sell power drills is to hang things up on their walls. Is not because they're carpenters or anything like that. Well, there's a lot of ways to solve that problem about hanging things on the wall. And sometimes the reason we're doing that is we want to beautify our space. Well, maybe that doesn't even involve a hole in the wall or a hook or something like that. Maybe it's just a coat of paint. So if our solution is more drills, we might end up producing things that solves for a very specific problem instead of the bigger problem that's out there.
Yeah, which is the problem of beautifying your spaces or making your spaces more livable.
Yeah.
Such an interesting example to share with folks. Another step in this process is around prototyping. And I, as we were going back and forth, we kind of came across this resource from Systems Concepts. But what are some steps that you would use in terms of the prototyping process?
Yeah, so one of the big things is that we often think about in design, a term that's used a lot is visual thinking. And effectively, really what that is taking those ideas and making them visual. And that is why often designers will have notebooks. We can use digital tools like Mural or Miro or Jamboard, or you can do kind of a little mix. Like often I've done this with clients very recently, is the idea about actually literally writing something out on a piece of paper, holding it up for a camera or taking a picture of it and sharing. Either way, whichever way you want to do things, the reason for that isn't because people just like taking notes, is that, that expression, let's get on the same page. This is a way to do that. And so by making things visible is one of the first ways we start to prototype things, because then we start to see logic. Like if you think about it, is when we're thinking about ideas, we're sort of thinking about cause and effect. So we're drawing sort of a linear relationship. But we know in practice that our relationship isn't just a straight line with things. It's three-dimensional. It's all these things. The more you can draw things, the more you can literally start to see spatial phenomena. One of the things that I recommend people do, whether it's developing a storyboard, for example, and that's a very common approach. It goes by different names in design. And really that idea is to sit back there and say, well, what happens? And, another tool or strategy that I often will use is talk about a day in the life So maybe just to back up a bit. So just, I was talking about educators. So if you think about the educational experience, you might think of the classroom, whether that's virtual or not. But if your goal, this is kind of coming back to the perception thing as well, is that if your goal is to educate, and educate might mean to create content for people that they're going to remember and use in their life, well, we not only need to worry about how we deliver that content, but like what happens when people come into the classroom. So now it might be outside of our remit, if you will, to worry if they've had a good night's sleep, or if they've, had something to eat that morning, or whether they had a, long commute if it's in person, or if they've had internet problems like we're having here, all those different things, but they all do affect the outcome. And so if you draw those things out, you start to see things like, oh yeah, all these assumptions we had in our product are part of this. And so you might not have control over all of them, but you can at least start to account for them, so you don't end up designing something that is highly affected by things that are like, you want to make sure that you deliver on what you say you're going to try and deliver, which means you might have to design something that fits for those other pieces.
Yeah, some of those other pieces that you're constrained by. But it is interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
The design as the things that you have in your control, and then the things that are constraints to you, but that you might change your design slightly to address some of those constraints, or you might add elements into your design that overcome some of those constraints. And I think, isn't it interesting that in the prototyping process, like you can draw it and visualize it, but then prototyping for me, I think, is about, then testing it in a small kind of way and iterating.
Absolutely. So one of the, an example of it takes a lot to develop those things, and a lot of money, particularly if you're creating a new piece of technology, you have to, the engineering behind that is pretty substantial. One of the tools you can use is something called paper prototyping. And all that is like, imagine, and here's a real world example. So in the earlier days of GPS, of creating, those, now we take it for granted, our cars have them in there, our phones have them in there. They then had two of their engineers sit in a parking lot and literally drive through the parking lot. So what they would say is, so what would be the first screen? So they would flip over a screen, like a piece of paper, to represent the different screen. Anyway, what that did was allow them to tout the how many different interfaces they would need for their screen, because the driver would have to spend so much time on their screen to try and make something work. And it saved them, millions of dollars in development time, because they could just do something as a paper prototype. So they took their ideas and made it into paper.
Oh, that's really interesting. It's kind of reminds me of, I don't know if I'm showing my age or anything like that, but my parents used to belong to the Canadian Automobile Association. And when you were going on long trips, you would get the maps of where you were going, and every page had a little bit of the map exposed to you. And so, as you moved forward, you turned. So that might have been an early version of the GPS system, right? And similar to the example that you just provided about how GPSs were designed. And yeah, it does make sense, because I know when I'm going places and I'm the person that's holding the GPS or trying to sort it all out, I kind of, zoom in and zoom out, right? On the screen. Let's talk about fit. So this is another part of the production thread. So what does fit mean? And where have you seen fit maybe work or not work so well?
Yeah, so one of the big things is fit. Fit is really understanding fit for purpose. So when we design things, is that how well does it fit for a particular purpose? And one of the best examples, again, to draw on the timeliness of things, is the pandemic. If you think about telemedicine, telemedicine has been around for a long time. E-health. I mean, we've had that for almost 20 years now. Most of us did not use it until the last two. Most of us hadn't had an experience with it. And part of the reason for that has a lot to do with it was the wrong fit. So it wasn't that we lacked the technology. I mean, the technology's obviously got better, but it wasn't that we couldn't do it. We've had Skype for a long time, for example. It's just that it didn't fit. And the fit was, it fit the technology, but it didn't fit patients, or it didn't fit the public. And it also didn't fit healthcare providers, because either they didn't know how to use it, they weren't able to bill for it, they weren't sure what kind of quality they could give. Well, what we've learned, and this is partly through prototyping only because we had to, was that there's a lot of things we can do digitally, for example. Like if you think about it, how often did we make somebody have to trudge down through the snow, for those of us who are in wintertime in Canada, which I think a lot of people visiting us today are in, but like, you know, go through the snow to get a simple prescription refill for something that we've been on for years, for example. Now all of a sudden we can log in and we can talk to our physician, and they can, you know, she or he can prescribe something digitally. All of a sudden it makes things much easier. It doesn't replace all, it's not a replacement for everything, but what we've realized is it started to work. And so what's happened is we've been able to find a fit. So the design, the other thing was also the technology. Originally, when things started out there were these special platforms. Well, now what we figured out is that there's a lot of open source and common engineering, I won't get into the technical things, that allow us to use things, open up a web browser. And we don't need to understand whether it's something, you know, it may be proprietary, but it works with whatever computer we have or our smartphone. Those kinds of things, that's really where the fit has really come in there. Before there wasn't the fit, because you need something special, or you need a special billing code, or you have to talk to a special physician. So that's just one example of where fit comes in. But we see this all the time. We have the right solution to the wrong problem.
Yeah, or there's a reticence, right, to embracing a solution, you know, like working remotely, for example. There's a reticence there, and you still see that in terms of people is remote for everybody, or there's a lot of that kind of stuff. And so what's the fit, right? What's the fit? What is the thing that you're trying to do? And then what's the right way of doing it, which is really the notion behind fit, I think.
Yeah. And just, you know, both you and I have both done virtual workshops. And I think the difference between doing a workshop now versus doing one even 2 years ago is that we've all had practice.
Yeah.
It wasn't that you know, our skills as a facilitator are you know, they're better now. Maybe they haven't changed that much, and maybe as learners they haven't changed that much. The technology hasn't changed that much, but we've all been able to get it to fit because we've had a chance to practice, try it out, try some new things. Another way of also thinking about fit is that I think we're a lot more forgiving of things not working perfectly, because we understand that there are some issues. And so we're all better at overcoming them and working with them. So that's another example of fit.
And it's also, I think, really important, fit for purpose, you know, those three words together, because what might work for one segment of the population may not necessarily work for another segment of the population, right? And so sometimes in design, we have to really, and that's some of that sensing and perceiving, that's where the two pieces come together, right? That we have the capability of saying, okay, so here's the audience, and is this the right fit for this audience, or is it a different kind of fit for another audience?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the important thing, is these things are also time bound. So we might have the right fit, we might have the perfect design for now, but it's why we always have to keep checking in, which is why that Helix is ongoing, because you know, what works today, you know, we've, again, to use pandemic as an example, is there are things that we did last year that worked really well that we're kind of a little tired of now. And, you know, they had their moment, and now we're kind of going past that. Or to doing something else. They've either advanced, maybe they're more sophisticated.
Yeah. Hey, the final thing is the design results and the sharing of the design results. This is, I think, a really critical step, or I think you're right. They're all critical, but this is an interesting one as well. So talk about this step.
So if, one of the things about design, I think this may be in some ways the most ultimate test that you've designed well. And that doesn't mean everything's perfect, is that if you feel you have something that you can share with people, we don't share things that we're embarrassed about, that we don't like, that don't work. We share the things we're proud of. Now that sounds kind of nice and kind of warm and fuzzy, but the reason why that is really simple is we also want to make sure that when we share things, the other things is that we have to explain it. We have to explain what it is that we're doing. And the easier it is to share means the easier it is to explain. And so that's always a really important thing, is that the ability for people to give it away is also another opportunity for us to learn a little bit more about what it is that we're doing. But giving it away, it doesn't necessarily mean IP, although we had a discussion about open source technologies and stuff ahead of time. But it's about that idea about when you produce, design is about getting things into the world. In many ways, design at its best is a very generous act. You're creating something to solve problems. And if you're solving the problem, is you're giving it away. That doesn't mean that you might not charge for things or something like that. But the idea is that you really want it in the hands of people, because otherwise, what are we doing? Like it's an exercise. And you'd think this would be an obvious thing, but it happens all the time. We work on projects and we think, great, we're done. We did what we said we were going to do. It's like, but has it been reached? Have people given, have we exchanged things? And it's in that implementation and the sharing of it that we learn a lot more about how it works, particularly for different populations and different contexts. And we again start to get that kind of information and go, how do we make this better? How do we make it more sustainable? How do we make it more just, fair, those kinds of things.
Really interesting. So as we kind of end our questions, and then we're going to share some resources in a minute. And if other people have questions, please put them either into the chat or the Q&A box. But what advice do you have, particularly around the production strand?
Yeah. So one of the things I would tell people is, and this is going to sound really simple, but you'd be surprised, the simple things are often the most difficult, is the production thing prototyping is really important. Get accustomed to making things. Get accustomed to sketching things. You're not in an art contest. This isn't about art. This is about visualizing things. If you can communicate with the people that you're designing with, whether it's your colleagues, the people that you're designing a service with, the public, whoever that is, if you can communicate with them with boxes and arrows, do it. If you can do it in very full illustrative things, do it. The advice I would give, and it is going to sound a little trite, is that really start doing that and feel comfortable doing that. If you do that as a means to an end, as part of being a good design practice, you'll feel more comfortable sharing things that are maybe ugly looking, that aren't pretty, that aren't finished, that are half-baked. But by doing that and doing that early, you're able to produce things better. Because one of the things that we often talk about in design, I'm not particularly fond of the expression fail fast to succeed sooner, because failure is one of those words that's got a lot of baggage attached to it. I think that failure means we know what we're going to get at the end, and sometimes we don't know what that means. But the spirit behind that is produce lots of things, and a lot of things won't turn out to be of much use, but it's in the practice of doing it that you start to find the things that do work.
Yeah.
And the more, just like anything, if you look at people who are exceptional at what they do, no matter what field, almost consistently, one of the most prominent things that's been found in the research is that people who are very successful have a high amount of attempts, which means they fail a lot, but they succeed a lot because they attempt a lot of things. So that's really the key thing. So the advice would be is that really start to attempt these things. Take things forward. Hedge your expectations a little bit to say that, you know what, as long as you can design something that's good enough. Because if we think again about that design helix going around and around, the first round is good enough. We're going to improve it. We're going to make it better. And then all of a sudden, it's a little bit better. It's a little bit better. It's a little bit better. It meets, it's got the right amount of fit. It's got the right amount of impact, whatever it is that we need. And the last piece of advice I would give is that if you're trying to tackle a gigantic problem, and I know as we've talked about this before, is that I like to use the concept of the smallest viable system, the invisible system is how can you take that giant problem and turn it into the smallest piece that you can tackle? Try that. If you can succeed with that small piece, scaffold off of that, and then scaffold off of that. That's the important things. Too often we scope our problem, the perception, we try and tackle, we're going to tackle poverty. Good luck with one shot. Why don't we break it down into something small and go, what can we do now that's going to have a big impact, but that we can knit into something bigger?
Before we go into the questions, Cameron, we have brought forward a couple of really good resources, I think, for the folks on the call to follow up on. So maybe walk us through, maybe in a minute or so, these resources.
Sure. So some of these are ones that I've developed. They're up on my website that we talked about at the beginning. One of them is I thought put number one is prototype death rate. And that is kind of it's a simple metric that you can use. But if you're worried about producing something, turn it into a bit of a game. See how many things you can possibly produce that you can eventually try and implement. So that's really what that is about. It's a kind of a simple thing. Second one is the idea of mentioned book storyboards. And this is really a technique that you can easily use that's using the same kind of tool that we use from filmmaking, is come up with a story, but how will people engage with your organization, your service, your product, or something like that? The more you can draw those things out, the more you can start to see all the different ways you might be able to design for them that go above and beyond what you're generating. Another one is, this is a great tool. It's an open source book. It's called This is Service Design. And there's another companion called This is Service Design Doing. They have tons of tools, toolkits available online. I don't think they have everything that's in the book, but I think you should be able to get the book for, if not free, a very low cost. So that's another one. And then two other things, visual thinking, just a primer on that one. And then the last one is, and this is a really one, this is the one that was you alerted us to, was the idea about 10 methods to help you innovate. There's no one thing to do. I mean, my view is the best tools to help you design are going to be the ones you use. So if you're going to try these things out, if there's things you don't like, there's lots of different ways to get to production. Try whatever's going to get you making things and getting it to a point where you want to implement it and share it. Those are the ones you should use.
So thanks, everybody. And we hope to see you in the final webinar in this series. And thanks again, Cameron.
Thanks, Liz. Take care, everyone. Be well.